Margaret Chen counted the coins one last time. 3 months of saving, 3 months of saying no to small pleasures, and finally she had enough. The ticket sat on her kitchen table, looking almost magical in the morning light. Tonight she would hear Victor Ashford play Rachmaninoff at the Metropolitan Concert Hall. She'd been a music teacher for 30 years in a small town 2 hours away. Now retired and living in the city near her daughter, she survived on a modest pension that covered rent, groceries, and not much else. But music had always been her first love, her true passion, and Victor Ashford was considered one of the greatest living pianists in the world. That evening, Margaret stood in front of her closet, looking at her limited options. The navy blue coat was her best one, though the sleeve had a stubborn stain and the hem was coming loose in one spot. Her dress was plain, nothing fancy, but clean and neat. She looked at herself in the mirror and took a deep breath. This wasn't about how she looked. This was about the music. The concert hall took her breath away when she arrived. It was all marble and gold with chandeliers that sparkled like stars. People streamed through the entrance dressed in clothes that probably cost more than her monthly rent. The women wore gowns that shimmered with every step. The men looked like they'd stepped out of fancy magazines, their suits perfectly tailored. Margaret joined the flow of people heading inside. She noticed the looks almost immediately. A woman in diamonds glanced at her coat and whispered something to her companion. A man in an expensive suit sidestepped as if making extra sure not to brush against her. Margaret felt her cheeks grow warm, but she kept walking. She had every right to be here. Her ticket was just as valid as anyone else's. Inside, the lobby was even more beautiful. The ceiling was painted with angels and clouds. The floor was so shiny she could see herself reflected in it. Margaret walked slowly, trying to take in every detail. She wanted to remember this night forever. She was looking up at a particularly beautiful chandelier when it happened. She walked straight into someone's back, not hard but enough to make him stumble slightly. His program slipped from his hands and papers scattered across the polished floor. "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry." Margaret immediately dropped down to help gather the papers. Her heart pounded with embarrassment. She could feel people stopping to watch. The man bent down too, but his movements were stiff and annoyed. His hands grabbed the papers quickly, almost yanking them away before she could help. "Perhaps you should watch where you're going," he said. His voice was cold, each word clipped and precise. Margaret looked up to apologize again and felt her stomach drop. She knew that face. She'd seen it on every poster around the city. Victor Ashford himself, the very pianist she'd come to see. "Mr. Ashford, I really am so sorry," she said, still on her knees, reaching for the last few papers. "I wasn't paying attention." He stood up, brushing off his tuxedo as if she'd gotten dirt on it. He didn't even look at her as he spoke. "Just be more careful." Then he turned and walked away, leaving her kneeling on the floor with the last of his papers in her hands. The silence around her was heavy. People stared. She heard the whispers start immediately, spreading through the crowd like ripples in water. "Can you believe that? Nearly knocked him over. What's someone dressed like that doing here anyway? Probably doesn't even know who he is." A young usher hurried over and helped Margaret to her feet. He had kind eyes and a gentle smile. "You okay, ma'am?" he asked softly. "Yes, thank you." Margaret handed him the papers. "Could you make sure Mr. Ashford gets these?" "Sure thing. And hey, don't worry about it. Accidents happen." He gave her an encouraging nod. Margaret made her way to find her seat, her hands shaking slightly. She'd imagined meeting Victor Ashford differently. She'd pictured maybe saying hello after the concert, telling him how much his music meant to her. She never thought their first meeting would be her bumping into him like a clumsy fool. Her seat was high up in the balcony, far from the stage. But Margaret didn't mind. She could see everything from up here. And the acoustics in a hall like this would be perfect no matter where you sat. She settled into her chair and tried to calm her racing heart. The encounter in the lobby bothered her more than she wanted to admit. Not just the embarrassment, but the coldness in his voice, the way he'd looked at her, or rather the way he hadn't really looked at her at all, like she wasn't worth his time, like she was beneath his notice. She'd always believed that great artists had great souls, that the beauty they created came from something beautiful inside them. Victor Ashford's recordings had moved her to tears. His interpretations of the classical masters were legendary. How could someone who played with such feeling be so cold to another person? The lights began to dim. The audience settled into expectant silence. Margaret pushed her hurt feelings aside. She was here for the music. That's what mattered. When Victor Ashford walked onto the stage, the audience erupted in applause. He bowed gracefully, sat at the grand piano, and adjusted the bench. Then his hands hovered over the keys for just a moment before they came down. The first notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3 filled the hall, and Margaret forgot everything else. She forgot the whispers and the stares. She forgot her worn coat and simple dress. She even forgot the cold way he'd dismissed her in the lobby, because this was pure magic. Victor's fingers flew across the keys with impossible speed and precision. The music swelled and crashed like ocean waves. The orchestra followed his lead, rising and falling with him. This piece was famous for being one of the hardest ever written, and he made it look effortless. Margaret closed her eyes and let the music wash over her. She'd studied this concerto for years, had taught it to advanced students, knew every note by heart. Hearing it played live by a master was like hearing it for the first time all over again. But then, in the third movement, something made her open her eyes. Her trained ear caught a tiny variation. She leaned forward, listening more carefully. There it was. In measure 247, he'd played an E-flat instead of an E natural. It was such a small thing. Most people in the audience probably didn't even notice. It was a common substitution that many pianists made because it added a bit more drama to that particular phrase. But it wasn't what Rachmaninoff had originally written. Margaret knew because she'd studied the composer's original manuscript years ago at Juilliard, before her life had taken a different path. She sat back, considering. Should it bother her? The performance was still magnificent. One tiny note didn't change that. But she couldn't help noticing it, couldn't help mentally correcting it in her mind. That was the curse of being a trained musician. You couldn't just listen for pleasure. Part of you was always analyzing, always comparing what you heard to what should be there. The concerto built to its powerful finale. The last notes rang out through the hall and the audience leaped to their feet. Margaret stood too, clapping until her hands hurt. Whatever else Victor Ashford might be, he was undeniably brilliant at his craft. As the applause continued, she noticed an announcement in her program. There would be a reception after the performance for VIP ticket holders. Margaret had splurged on the upgraded ticket specifically for this chance. She'd wanted the full experience, wanted to be part of the world of classical music for just one night. Now she wasn't sure she wanted to go. The thought of running into Victor Ashford again made her stomach knot. But she'd paid for the ticket, and she'd never been to anything like this before. She might never get another chance. Margaret made her decision. She would go to the reception. She would hold her head high, and if Victor Ashford was there, she would simply stay out of his way. She had no idea that staying out of his way would turn out to be impossible, and that before the night was over, everything would change. The reception hall was just as elegant as the lobby. Tables draped in white cloth held crystal glasses filled with champagne. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved through the crowd carrying silver trays of fancy appetizers. Margaret accepted a glass of sparkling water and stood near the wall, content to observe. She watched the guests mingle and laugh. They all seemed to know each other, or at least knew how to act like they did. Air kisses, firm handshakes, the casual name-dropping of important people in expensive places. This was their world. Margaret was just visiting. A small crowd had formed near the center of the room. Margaret could see Victor Ashford at its heart, still in his performance tuxedo, accepting compliments with gracious nods. People practically glowed when he spoke to them, as if his attention was a gift they'd treasure forever. She should just stay where she was. Enjoy her water, maybe try one of those fancy appetizers, and then go home with her memories intact. But her feet had other ideas. Almost without thinking, she found herself drifting closer to the group. They were discussing the performance. A woman in a red dress was gushing about the second movement. "The way you handled the transition was absolutely sublime," she said. "I've never heard it played with such sensitivity." Others chimed in with their own praise. Victor accepted it all with practiced humility, though Margaret noticed how he seemed to straighten slightly with each compliment, like a plant turning toward the sun. There was a brief pause in the conversation. Margaret saw her opening. "Mr. Ashford," she said quietly, "your interpretation of the second movement really was remarkable. The way you brought out the counter melody in the left hand while keeping the primary theme singing in the right. It was exactly how Rachmaninoff intended it. The group turned to look at her. She felt their eyes taking in her simple dress, her worn coat draped over her arm. Victor's gaze settled on her, and she saw a flicker of recognition. The woman from the lobby, the one who'd bumped into him. And you are? His tone was polite but cool, the way you might speak to someone who'd interrupted an important conversation. I'm Margaret Chen. I taught music for many years. I just wanted to tell you how much I enjoyed the performance. Ah. Victor's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. A music teacher. He said it the way someone might say, a person who collects stamps or someone who watches a lot of television. Polite. Acknowledgement of something fundamentally unimportant. The woman in red laughed lightly. How wonderful that you appreciate classical music. Do you teach piano? I did, yes. For 30 years. Margaret felt herself growing smaller under their collective gaze. Victor took a sip of his champagne. Tell me, Mrs. Chen, what level did you teach? Beginners, I assume. I taught all levels. Beginners through advanced. Advanced. Victor repeated the word as if tasting it. So you'd have your students work up to what? Chopin's easier nocturnes? Maybe a simple Mozart sonata? Heat crept up Margaret's neck. She could hear the condescension in his voice, see the amusement in his eyes. I taught whatever my students were ready for. Some of them went on to study at conservatories. How nice for them. Victor's attention was already shifting away from her, back to the well-dressed admirers who hung on his every word. But then he seemed to remember something. He turned back to Margaret with a look of exaggerated concern. I hope you tell your students that music education is valuable. Even if they never perform professionally, it's a lovely hobby to have. A hobby. 30 years of her life. Thousands of students, countless hours of practice and preparation reduced to a hobby. Margaret's hands tightened around her glass. A man in an expensive suit jumped in. Victor, you're being too modest. Not everyone can appreciate what you do at the level you do it. It takes years of intensive training, natural talent, the right opportunities. He glanced at Margaret. No offense, of course, but teaching children Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star is rather different from performing Rachmaninoff at Carnegie Hall. The group laughed. Not meanly exactly, but not kindly either. It was the laughter of people who felt superior and comfortable in that superiority. Victor smiled and delivered what he clearly thought was the final word on the subject. Indeed. Perhaps we should leave the analysis of performances like tonight's to those who actually perform at this level. He raised his champagne glass slightly, as if toasting his own wisdom. After all, those who can do, those who can't teach. Isn't that how the saying goes? The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She'd heard that phrase before, of course. Every teacher had. But hearing it said so casually, so dismissively in front of all these people, made her breath catch in her throat. She should walk away. She should just turn around and leave with whatever dignity she had left. But something inside her refused to let it go. Maybe it was the way Victor was already turning away from her, done with her, dismissing her entire life's work with a careless quote. Maybe it was thinking about all her students over the years, the ones who'd discovered their love of music in her little studio. Maybe it was just that she was tired of being invisible. Mr. Ashford, she said, her voice quiet but clear. Do you know what you played incorrectly in measure 247 of the third movement? The conversation stopped. Victor turned back to her slowly, his expression shifting from dismissive to irritated. Excuse me? Margaret's heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. In the third movement, measure 247, you substituted an E-flat for an E natural. The silence in their little circle was complete. Someone in a nearby group stopped mid-sentence to listen. Victor stared at her, his jaw tight. That's impossible. I've performed this concerto for 15 years. I think I know every note. I'm sure you do know it very well, Margaret said. But that particular substitution is quite common. Many pianists make it because the E-flat adds a bit more drama to the phrase. It sounds more impressive, but it's not what Rachmaninoff wrote in his original manuscript. A woman near Victor pulled out her phone. I can look this up, she murmured, already typing. Victor's face had gone slightly pale, but his voice remained sharp. The original manuscript? And how would you know what's in the original manuscript? Did you study it at your little music school? At Juilliard, actually, Margaret said quietly. Before I became a teacher. That got everyone's attention. The woman with the phone looked up. The man in the expensive suit raised his eyebrows. Even Victor seemed momentarily thrown off balance, but he recovered quickly. Juilliard. He drew the word out, making it sound doubtful. Really, and yet here you are, a retired music teacher. If you'd actually studied at Juilliard, one would think you'd have pursued performance yourself. Margaret felt the old pain flicker in her chest, but she pushed it down. Some of us had different paths in life. Victor's eyes glittered with something that looked like triumph mixed with cruelty. Different paths. Yes, of course. Tell me, if you're such an expert on Rachmaninoff, if you studied at this prestigious conservatory, why don't you play something for us? He gestured toward a beautiful grand piano that sat in the corner of the reception hall, clearly meant as decoration. There's a piano right there. Show us what a Juilliard education produces. The group's attention focused entirely on Margaret now. She could feel them waiting, expecting her to make an excuse, to back down, to admit she couldn't do it. She saw the challenge in Victor's eyes, the certainty that he'd cornered her. The woman with the phone spoke up softly. He's right. About the E-flat, I mean. According to this analysis of the manuscript, Rachmaninoff did write an E natural in that measure. The E-flat is a common modern variation. Victor barely glanced at the phone. He was still staring at Margaret, waiting for her to refuse, to slink away in embarrassment. Well, he said, we're all waiting. Unless, of course, you'd prefer to simply observe. Like a true teacher. Margaret looked at the piano in the corner. She hadn't performed publicly in over 20 years. Her hands weren't what they used to be. The old injury still limited her, especially when she was tired or nervous. And right now she was both. But she was also tired of being dismissed, tired of being treated as less than, tired of people like Victor Ashford looking through her as if she didn't matter. She set down her glass of water on a nearby table. All right, she said simply. I'll play something for you. Victor's smile widened, confident and cruel. He thought he'd won. He thought she was about to humiliate herself in front of everyone. He had no idea what was coming. Margaret walked toward the piano, and the entire reception hall seemed to hold its breath. Margaret's shoes clicked softly on the polished floor as she crossed the reception hall. Every eye in the room seemed to follow her. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the waiters stopped moving, trays balanced in their hands, watching this small drama unfold. The piano sat in the corner like a sleeping giant. It was a beautiful instrument, a Steinway grand with a glossy black finish that reflected the chandelier light. Margaret had no idea if it was properly tuned or how the action would feel. She hadn't asked to play. She'd been challenged, pushed into a corner by a man who thought he already knew how this would end. She reached the piano and stood beside it for a moment, her hand resting lightly on its smooth surface. Behind her, she could hear people gathering closer, forming a loose semicircle. They wanted to witness this. The presumptuous music teacher who claimed to have gone to Juilliard, about to embarrass herself in front of the great Victor Ashford. Margaret pulled out the bench and sat down slowly. The height was wrong for her, too low, but she didn't adjust it. Her hands rested in her lap and she closed her eyes. She needed a moment. Just one moment to steady herself. 23 years. That's how long it had been since she'd played for an audience. 23 years since the accident that had changed everything. She'd been driving home from a competition, exhausted but happy. She'd placed first. Her future had seemed so bright, so certain. Then a truck had run a red light, and in an instant everything shattered. The injury to her left hand had been severe. 3 surgeries, months of physical therapy, and still the doctors said she'd never play professionally again. The nerve damage was too extensive. She could manage daily tasks fine, could even play casually, but the speed and precision required for a concert career, impossible. She'd had a choice then. Continue therapy that might restore some more function, or help her mother through cancer treatment. The therapy wasn't covered by insurance. Neither was her mother's experimental treatment. Margaret could only afford one. She'd chosen her mother without hesitation, and she'd never regretted it, not even when her mother passed away 2 years later. Not even when she watched her former classmates go on to brilliant careers while she taught scales to 7-year-olds in a small-town studio. But the music never left her. It lived in her bones, in her blood, in every breath she took. She might not perform on grand stages, but she'd passed her love of music to hundreds of students. Some had gone on to conservatories. Some had become professional musicians. Most had simply learned to appreciate beauty in a world that often felt harsh and cold. That was enough. It had to be enough. Margaret opened her eyes and looked down at the keys. Her hands were trembling. She placed them gently on the ivory, feeling the cool smoothness under her fingertips. The left hand, the injured one, felt stiff. She flexed her fingers carefully, testing. From somewhere behind her, she heard Victor's voice, pitched just loud enough for others to hear. Perhaps something simple would be best. No need to overextend yourself. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Nervous, anticipatory laughter. Margaret took a deep breath. Something simple. Yes, she could play something simple. A gentle piece that wouldn't strain her damaged hand. Something safe. But then she thought about the way Victor had looked at her. The casual cruelty in his voice when he'd quoted that terrible phrase about teachers. The assumption that she was less than him, worth less, simply because she'd spent her life teaching instead of performing. Her hands shifted on the keys, moving into position, not for something simple. For something that would make her point better than words ever could. She was going to play La Campanella. It was arguably one of the most difficult pieces in the entire classical repertoire. Liszt had written it to showcase the absolute limits of technical ability. Lightning-fast runs, enormous leaps across the keyboard, trills that needed to sound like bells ringing. Most professional pianists struggled with it. Many avoided it entirely, and Margaret was going to play it with a damaged left hand. After 23 years of not performing, in front of a hostile audience, she was probably insane, but her fingers found the opening notes and suddenly the years fell away. The first delicate melody emerged from the piano, clear and sweet. It started quietly, almost innocently, like a music box winding up. Then the first big run came, cascading down the keyboard. Her right hand flew, muscle memory taking over. The left hand followed, slower, more careful, but there. The notes sparkled in the air like the bells the piece was named after. Margaret forgot about the audience. She forgot about Victor Ashford and his cruel smile. She forgot about her worn coat and her modest pension, and the fact that she hadn't done this in over 2 decades. There was only the music, only the conversation between her hands and the piano, a conversation she'd been having since she was 5 years old. The piece demanded everything. Her fingers stretched for intervals that seemed impossible. Her left hand, the weak one, had to match the speed of her right. There were moments when she felt it faltering, when the old injury screamed in protest. But she pushed through, finding alternate fingerings, adjusting on the fly, making it work. Sweat formed on her brow. Her arms ached. But the music kept coming, pouring out of her like water from a broken dam. All those years of holding back, of playing simple pieces with students, of keeping her own abilities carefully hidden away, suddenly released in this one moment. The famous middle section approached, the part where the melody rang out like church bells, while the accompaniment danced underneath. Her right hand sang the notes clearly, each one perfect and true. Her left hand provided the foundation, steady despite the pain. She could feel the audience behind her, their shocked silence. But she couldn't think about that now. The final section was coming, the part where Liszt seemed determined to break every pianist who dared attempt his work. Octave leaps, impossible stretches, speed that seemed superhuman. Margaret's hands were on fire, her left hand especially, the damaged nerves protesting every movement. But she was so close now, so close to the end. The final cascade of notes approached, climbing higher and higher up the keyboard. Her fingers flew, barely touching the keys before jumping to the next position. And then the last triumphant chord, loud and clear and perfect. Margaret's hands came down on the final notes and stayed there, pressing into the keys as if to keep herself from collapsing. Her whole body shook. Her breath came in gasps. Her left hand felt like it was filled with broken glass, but she'd done it. She'd actually done it. The silence in the reception hall was absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Margaret sat at the piano, her hands still on the keys, afraid to turn around and see their faces. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, someone began to clap. Just one person at first, slow and deliberate. Then another joined in. And another. Within seconds, the entire room erupted in applause. Margaret finally turned on the bench to face them. The crowd was on their feet, all of them, clapping like their lives depended on it. Some people had tears on their cheeks. Others stood with their mouths open, still processing what they'd just witnessed. Her eyes found Victor Ashford in the crowd. He stood frozen, his face completely pale. His hands hung at his sides, motionless. He wasn't clapping. He wasn't smiling. He just stared at her like he'd seen a ghost. Margaret stood slowly, her legs unsteady. She smoothed down her simple dress with shaking hands. The applause continued, wave after wave of it, but she barely heard it. An elderly man pushed through the crowd, moving faster than someone his age should probably move. He had white hair and tears streaming down his weathered face. "Margaret?" he said, his voice breaking. "Margaret Chen?" She turned toward the voice and felt her heart skip. She knew that face, even aged by 25 years. "Professor Morrison?" The old man reached her and pulled her into a tight embrace, sobbing openly now. "My dear girl," he whispered. "My brilliant, wonderful girl. I never thought I'd hear you play again." Margaret hugged him back, her own tears finally breaking free. Professor Morrison had been her primary teacher at Juilliard. He'd been the one to tell her, gently but honestly, that her performing career was over after the accident. He'd held her while she cried, and he'd been the one to suggest that teaching might be her new path. He pulled back, holding her at arm's length, looking at her face. Then he turned to address the crowd, his voice ringing with emotion and authority. Professor Morrison's voice cut through the applause, commanding attention the way only a true teacher could. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his words thick with emotion, "let me tell you about the woman you just heard play." The crowd quieted, though people continued wiping their eyes and exchanging amazed looks. Margaret tried to tug on the professor's sleeve, uncomfortable with suddenly being the center of attention, but he gently squeezed her hand and continued. "This is Margaret Chen. 25 years ago, she was my student at Juilliard. Not just any student. She was the most gifted pianist I taught in 40 years of teaching." His voice cracked slightly. By her third year, she was already receiving offers from major orchestras. Record labels were interested. Her future was blindingly bright. Margaret felt her cheeks burning. She glanced toward Victor, who still stood motionless, his expression unreadable. Then, one night after winning a major competition, she was in a terrible car accident. A drunk driver ran a red light. Professor Morrison paused, collecting himself. The injuries to her left hand were severe. 3 surgeries. Months of physical therapy. The doctors told us she'd never play professionally again. The nerve damage was too extensive. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several people looked at Margaret's left hand as if they could see the damage from where they stood. But that's not even the hardest part of her story. The professor continued. Margaret had a choice to make. She could continue with therapy that might restore some additional function to her hand, or she could pay for her mother's cancer treatment. Insurance wouldn't cover both. He looked at Margaret with such tenderness that she had to look away. She chose her mother without a second thought. The room was completely silent now. Even the waiters stood still, trays forgotten. So Margaret became a teacher. She moved to a small town, opened a little studio, and spent the next 30 years teaching children and teenagers to love music the way she loved it. Some of her students went on to study at conservatories. Several are now professional musicians themselves. Professor Morrison's voice grew stronger. She gave up her own dreams so others could pursue theirs. That's who she is. That's what a real musician looks like. The applause started again, even louder than before, but this time it felt different to Margaret. Not just appreciation for her playing, but something deeper. Understanding, perhaps. Recognition of a sacrifice they hadn't known about moments ago. Victor finally moved. He walked toward Margaret slowly, his face still pale. The crowd parted to let him through. When he reached her, he stopped a few feet away, as if unsure whether he had the right to come closer. He started, then stopped. His usual smooth confidence had completely evaporated. "I don't know what to say." Margaret looked at him steadily. Her left hand throbbed with pain, but she kept it relaxed at her side. "You don't have to say anything, Mr. Ashford. But I do." He ran a hand through his hair, messing up the perfect styling. "What I said to you earlier about teaching, about—" He couldn't seem to finish the sentence. "About those who can't teach?" Margaret supplied quietly. Victor flinched like she'd slapped him. "Yes, that I was cruel. I was arrogant. He looked around at the watching crowd, then back at her. "I was wrong. Completely wrong." Margaret nodded slowly but didn't speak. She wasn't going to make this easier for him. He'd earned this discomfort. "You were also right," Victor continued, "about the E-flat in measure 247. I checked the score during the reception. You were absolutely correct. He shook his head. I've been playing it wrong for 15 years, and a woman I dismissed as a simple music teacher caught it immediately. I wasn't just any music teacher, Margaret said softly. And there's no such thing as just a music teacher anyway. Every musician you admire, every performer on every stage, got there because a teacher showed them how, believed in them, pushed them to be better. Victor nodded, looking down at his expensive shoes. You're right. Of course you're right. The woman in the red dress spoke up from the crowd. I think we all owe you an apology, Mrs. Chen. The way we laughed when... She trailed off, embarrassed. When you assumed I didn't belong here? Margaret finished gently. When you looked at my coat and my dress and decided I couldn't possibly understand music the way you do. Several people had the grace to look ashamed. The man in the expensive suit who'd made the comment about teaching children, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star," seemed to be studying the floor intently. Margaret took a deep breath. This was her moment, and she needed to say what she'd learned over all these years. Here's what I want all of you to understand. Music isn't about concert halls and fancy clothes. It's not about who performs on the biggest stages or who gets the most applause. Music is about connection. It's about expressing something true and beautiful that words can't capture. She looked around the room, meeting eyes that had dismissed her an hour ago. I've taught students who went on to perform at Carnegie Hall. I've also taught students who learned one simple piece and played it at their grandmother's funeral because it was her favorite song. Both of those things matter. Both of those things are music. Professor Morrison squeezed her shoulder supportively. Victor stood listening, his earlier arrogance completely stripped away. And yes, I became a teacher because I couldn't perform anymore. But you know what? I taught a little boy who'd been in a terrible accident and was depressed and angry. Music gave him a way to express what he couldn't say out loud. I taught a teenager whose parents were divorcing, and playing piano was the only hour of her week that felt peaceful. I taught a girl with severe anxiety who found that performing in small recitals helped her manage her fear. Margaret's voice grew stronger. So when someone says those who can't, teach as if teaching is a failure, as if it's something to be ashamed of, they're really saying that the most important work, the work of passing on knowledge and passion and love to the next generation, doesn't matter, and that's simply not true. The room was completely silent. Several people were crying openly now, though Margaret suspected some of them had teachers in their own past they were remembering. Victor stepped closer. Mrs. Chen, Margaret, I need you to know that I checked the recording from tonight's performance. I'm going to have it corrected before it's released. And I'm going to credit you in the notes for catching my error. That's not necessary, Margaret said. It absolutely is necessary, Victor insisted. You've taught me something tonight that's more valuable than any technical correction. You've reminded me why I started playing in the first place. It wasn't for the applause or the prestige. It was because music made me feel something I couldn't feel any other way. He looked at her with genuine humility now. Somewhere along the way I forgot that. I let the fame and the praise turn me into someone I don't much like. Someone who looks down on a woman in a simple coat, who judges people by their appearance instead of their knowledge, who thinks that performing makes me superior to teaching. It's easy to forget, Margaret said gently. Success can do that to people. But you can choose to remember again. Victor held out his hand. Would you allow me to apologize properly? And perhaps if you're willing, I'd like to learn more about that manuscript you studied. I clearly have some things to relearn. Margaret looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment. Then she took it. Apology accepted, Mr. Ashford. Please call me Victor, then call me Margaret. As they shook hands, the crowd burst into applause again. But this time, Margaret noticed it felt different. Not applause for a performance, but applause for something more important, for understanding reached, for humility learned, for the recognition that every person has value, regardless of how they look or where they come from. Professor Morrison pulled her into another hug. I'm so proud of you, he whispered. Not just for how you played tonight, but for the person you've become. Margaret hugged him back, finally letting herself fully feel the emotion of the evening. Her left hand still ached terribly. She'd probably pay for this performance with days of pain, but it had been worth it. Not to prove herself to Victor or anyone else, but to remind herself of who she'd once been, who she still was underneath everything. As the reception began to wind down and people started gathering their coats, Victor approached her one more time. Margaret, I have a question. Would you consider giving a master class? Perhaps at the conservatory where I sometimes teach. Your insights into Rachmaninoff alone would be invaluable, but I think your story, your perspective, could teach my students something they desperately need to learn. Margaret smiled. I'll think about it, Victor. I'll definitely think about it. She gathered her old coat and prepared to leave. As she walked through the lobby one last time, she held her head high. The same people who'd whispered about her earlier now nodded respectfully. Some even smiled. Margaret stepped out into the cool night air and took a deep breath. The street was quieter now, most of the concert-goers having already left in their expensive cars and private drivers. She pulled her worn coat tighter and started walking toward the bus stop, her left hand cradled gently against her body. The pain had settled into a deep, familiar ache. Margaret, wait! She turned to see Victor hurrying after her, still in his tuxedo, a long coat thrown over his shoulders. He was slightly out of breath when he reached her. Please let me at least call you a car, he said. After everything tonight, it's the least I can do. Margaret shook her head with a small smile. The bus is fine. I've been taking it for years. But your hand, you're in pain, I can see it. Victor looked genuinely distressed. Please, I insist. There was something different in his voice now. Not the commanding tone of someone used to getting his way, but a genuine request from someone who wanted to help. Margaret studied his face for a moment, then nodded. All right. Thank you. As they waited for the car Victor had called, he shifted his weight awkwardly. Can I ask you something? Why did you choose that piece? La Campanella, of all things. You could have played something simpler, easier on your hand. Margaret looked up at the stars barely visible through the city lights. Because you expected me to play something simple. You expected me to fail to prove that you were right about me. She looked back at him, and I was tired of people underestimating me because of how I look or what I do for a living. I deserve that, Victor said quietly. The humiliation. I wasn't trying to humiliate you, Margaret replied. I was trying to remind you and everyone else in that room that every person has a story. You can't judge someone's worth by their clothes or their job title or whether they perform on a stage. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb. Victor opened the door for her, but before she got in, he spoke again. Margaret, I meant what I said about the master class. I really would like you to teach my students. But more than that, I'd like to learn from you myself. Margaret paused, one foot in the car. What could you possibly learn from me? You're one of the greatest pianists in the world. Technique, maybe not, Victor admitted. But everything else? How to stay humble. How to remember why music matters. How to treat people with respect regardless of who they are. He looked down at his hands. How to be a better person. Those are lessons I desperately need. Margaret settled into the car seat and looked up at him. You know what the real difference is between you and me, Victor? It's not talent. It's not even about who ended up on stage and who ended up in a classroom. Then what is it? You play for the applause. I played tonight because I had something to say. Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. Music should never be about proving you're better than someone else. It should be about connecting with something deeper, something true. When you remember that, you'll be an even greater musician than you already are. Victor stood silently for a moment, absorbing her words. Then he nodded slowly. Thank you. For tonight. For the lesson. For not giving up on me even when I was awful to you. Everyone deserves a second chance, Margaret said. Even arrogant concert pianists. For the first time that evening, Victor laughed. A real laugh without any edge to it. Especially arrogant concert pianists, apparently. As the car pulled away, Margaret watched Victor's figure recede in the rear window. He stood on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, looking smaller somehow than he had at the beginning of the evening. More human. The driver glanced at her in the mirror. That was quite something back there, ma'am. My wife's a music teacher. She's always saying nobody respects what she does. I can't wait to tell her about tonight, Margaret smiled. Your wife does important work. Please tell her that from me. When the car dropped her off at her modest apartment building, Margaret climbed the 3 flights of stairs slowly, each step making her hand throb more. Inside her small apartment, she made herself a cup of tea and ran warm water over her left hand, trying to ease the ache. The apartment was quiet. Just her and the upright piano against the wall, the same piano she'd practiced on for decades. It wasn't a grand Steinway. It was just a serviceable instrument that needed tuning more often than she could afford. but it was hers. Margaret sat at her piano bench and looked at the keys. She thought about the evening, about the girl she'd been 25 years ago with the world at her feet. She thought about the choice she'd made, giving up her dreams for her mother. She thought about all the students she'd taught, all the lives she'd touched in small but meaningful ways. She'd spent so many years wondering, what if? What if there had been no accident? What if she'd had enough money for both her mother's treatment and her own therapy? What if she'd become the concert pianist everyone said she would be? But tonight had given her a different perspective. Yes, she'd lost the career she'd planned, but she'd gained something else. She'd learned compassion through suffering. She'd learned humility through setbacks. She'd learned that real strength wasn't about perfect performances in concert halls, but about showing up every day and doing work that mattered, even when nobody was watching. Her phone buzzed. A text from Professor Morrison. "I'm still shaking. You were magnificent. Let's have lunch this week." Then another text, this one from an unknown number. "This is Victor. Professor Morrison gave me your number. I hope that's all right. I wanted to say again how sorry I am, and how grateful I am for tonight. You changed something in me. I won't forget it." Margaret smiled and set her phone down. She placed her fingers lightly on the piano keys, not pressing down, just feeling their familiar smoothness. Tomorrow her hand would hurt even more. But tonight had been worth every bit of pain. She thought about Victor's offer to teach a master class. Maybe she would do it. Maybe it was time to share her knowledge with a wider audience, to show more people that music wasn't just about technical perfection, but about heart and soul and connection. Or maybe she'd just keep teaching in her quiet way, touching one life at a time. Both paths had value. Both paths mattered. Margaret finally pressed down on the keys, playing a simple melody. Not Liszt or Rachmaninoff, just a gentle piece she'd learned as a child. The notes floated through her small apartment, pure and true. She thought about the look on Victor's face when she'd finished playing La Campanella. The shock, the recognition, the shame, but also something else, something that gave her hope. The willingness to learn. The courage to admit he'd been wrong. That was the real victory of the evening. Not that she'd proved she could still play, though that had felt wonderful. Not that she'd put Victor in his place, though he'd certainly needed it. The real victory was that she'd helped someone see the world differently. She'd reminded a brilliant but arrogant man that every person has worth, that kindness matters more than status, and that true greatness comes from lifting others up, not putting them down. As a teacher, she'd known these lessons for years, but tonight she'd taught them in a way that people would remember, not through a lecture or a gentle correction, but through action, through courage, through the simple act of sitting at a piano and showing them who she really was. Margaret played a few more notes, then closed the piano lid gently. Her left hand throbbed, reminding her of everything she'd lost and everything she'd gained. The scars of the past had shaped her, but they hadn't broken her. They'd made her stronger, wiser, more compassionate. She thought about all the students she'd taught over the years. The shy ones who found their voice through music. The angry ones who found peace. The sad ones who found joy. Each one of them had taught her something in return. They'd shown her that success wasn't measured by applause or fame, but by the quiet moments of connection, the small breakthroughs, the tears of joy when someone finally understood. Tomorrow she'd wake up and her hand would ache. But she'd also wake up knowing that she'd made a difference, that she'd stood up for every teacher who'd ever been dismissed or belittled, that she'd shown a room full of people that appearances mean nothing compared to what's in someone's heart. And maybe, just maybe, she'd inspired Victor Ashford to be not just a better pianist, but a better person. Margaret turned off the lights and went to her bedroom. As she lay in bed waiting for sleep, she thought about the young usher who'd helped her up after she'd bumped into Victor. His kindness in that moment of embarrassment had meant everything. Tomorrow she'd find a way to thank him, because that's what tonight had really been about. Not revenge or proving a point, but showing that kindness matters, that respect matters, that every person you meet has a story worth hearing and a dignity worth honoring. Victor Ashford had scoffed at a simple woman in a worn coat. But that simple woman had taught him the most valuable lesson of his career. And somehow, Margaret thought as she drifted off to sleep, that felt like the perfect ending to what had started as a terrible evening. Not because she'd won some contest, but because she'd reminded everyone, including herself, of who she truly was, a musician, A teacher, a person who'd faced loss and chosen love. A woman who measured success not in applause but in lives touched, hearts opened and music shared. And that, Margaret knew, was worth more than any concert hall performance could ever be.